So last week, we started the Bill of Rights, which is actually one of my favorite topics. So last week we went over, of course, the initial Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. So as we talked about quite extensively throughout the year, you guys know there's actually 27 amendments in total since the writing of our Constitution. So what we're going over with this for this week is basically the amendments that were added after the Civil War, and in particular the amendments that were added to basically further suffrage for African Americans and other minority groups throughout our nation's histories. So we're going to go over the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, the 19th, the 24th, and 26th Amendments, otherwise known as the Voting Rights Amendments. So for today's standard, we're going to go over standard 3.7. And 3.7 says, analyze the impact of the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments on participation of minority groups in the American political process. So we are not going to go over 3.5. As you guys know, we've already done that, but we're not going to focus on that today. Today, we're solely going to focus on 3.7, and we're going to go over the impact of these amendments on our nation's history. So just a quick backdrop related to the Civil War. So from the beginning of our nation's history, as you guys already know, we had slavery. So one of the precursors for slavery is basically that slavers would basically go to Africa, kidnap Africans, and bring them back to the Americas to serve as life-term slaves, basically. And basically they were slaves until they died. So what happens is over time that becomes an issue, and I won't get into all the details of it because of course you're going to see it later when you go into American history. But basically what happens is there is a divide, and the southern states want to keep slavery, northern states not so much. So the election of Abraham Lincoln is going to usher in the period where the southern states are going to withdraw from the Union at that point, and they're going to actually declare war on the northern part, which ultimately becomes the battle known as the Civil War. So basically it was a battle between the North versus the South. Thousands of, if not millions of men were killed in battle, but eventually the North is victorious and they win the Civil War. So before the Civil War ends, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln is going to pass the Emancipation Proclamation. And basically it was just an executive order, we talked about that before, that basically told slaves that they were free. But during this period, he also worked on the 13th Amendment, which was to abolish slavery. But as you guys know, unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1865. And that's going to usher in this period of after the Civil War, now what do we do? You know, this guy that kind of took us into this war is no longer alive. They're going to have a new president who is basically, as you can say, pro the southern states because he was from a southern state himself. And all of these issues are going to start to come about. Finally, on December 6th, 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed. And the 13th Amendment says exactly this. This is what you see right here. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. And so basically what that amendment did was it abolished slavery completely. Now, again, we talked about before with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, that was only an executive order. So we talked about this before when we talked about the executive branch. Executive orders can be overturned by the next president. So what Lincoln, and at this period they call them the radical Republicans, what they wanted to do, they wanted to make sure that there was something in the Constitution that states slavery is abolished. And that's what happens with the 13th Amendment. But again, unfortunately, Lincoln is assassinated in April of that year before the 13th Amendment is actually ratified. And the radical Republicans are going to basically start to pass a whole lot of amendments geared towards ensuring the rights of African Americans are obtained in the United States. So right after they passed the 13th Amendment, up next they passed the 14th Amendment in 1868. Now you guys remember we talked about this quite extensively at the beginning of the year when we went over citizenship. But the 14th Amendment is important because, again, this was the period after the Civil War, and they're trying to grant rights for African Americans, but they first have to deal with the issue of citizenship, and I'll get into why that's going to happen later. So the 14th Amendment says exactly this. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. So again, this amendment was designed to grant citizenship and protect the rights of former slaves. So with the 14th Amendment, one of the things they wanted to basically kind of iron out, if you will, is that if you're born here, you're automatically a citizen. And so the reason why this comes about because as we know, we went over this before with citizenship, you're a citizen through, of course, two ways naturally, law of blood and law of soil. So we know law of law of soil says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. So at this period in 1868, most slaves that were in the United States were born in the United States. Again, slavery dates way back to the 1600s, so it's very rare in 1868 that you would see any slaves that were not born in the United States. So they're going to pass this amendment to make sure that people that are born here are legally recognized as citizens. And that's going to be important later because, of course, when you get into state laws and state violations, you got to be at least a citizen in order to sue for your rights. The 14th Amendment in itself is very long in terms of being an amendment. And one of the parts on there where it says no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. This is super important, especially for the next couple of weeks when we get into these landmark Supreme Court cases. So what happens is the 14th Amendment is added because many states, not just the South, many states are going to basically do whatever they want as it relates to denying African Americans their basic rights. So the radical Republicans added this piece to the 14th Amendment because they were aware that there was no constitutional protection for African Americans at this period, and states were doing whatever they want. So I know you guys before have heard of the Jim Crow laws. Basically, the Jim Crow laws is just what you see here in this picture. You had many of the southern states, but again, not just the South, many states would have rules on the books, if you will, that intentionally discriminated against African Americans. So, for example, here, a water faucet, you would see one water faucet was only for whites, and then another was only for blacks. Well, again, the 14th Amendment technically did not allow that, but this piece was not being enforced until later, but we'll get into how they started to enforce it later on. But very important part, you got to remember that state laws before the 14th Amendment were pretty much designed to discriminate against African Americans. And so one of the parts that later on, especially when African Americans start to sue for their rights, they're going to add this piece about the Equal Protection Clause. And basically, it just says what we stated before. The 14th Amendment says that states cannot violate your constitutional rights, which is everybody is allowed equal protection under the law, no matter what. If you're a citizen, you are allowed equal protection. So you can't discriminate against people just because that's what you believe. The Constitution does not allow for it. And so you're going to see this later, especially when we get into those cases where African Americans are going to band together and sue because, of course, this is in the Constitution. And we know states cannot violate the Constitution due to, of course, the supremacy clause in the Constitution. And so the next amendment that's going to be passed by those radical Republicans is the 15th Amendment of 1870. And if you guys notice, we talked about before how hard it is to pass an amendment on the federal level. It is extremely hard. One, it is very hard to get the amount of states needed to pass amendments, yet alone, of course, getting Congress to all agree about what should be added to the Constitution. But if you notice with all of these amendments, especially from 13 all the way up until 15, they are literally like right behind each other. So you have the 14th Amendment, which is in 1868, then you have the 15th Amendment in 1870. These are all amendments, again, guaranteed to make sure African Americans can have a equal battle when they go out into the world post-slavery. So the 15th Amendment, basically the whole design of that was to guarantee African American men the right to vote. Not women, African American men. They wanted to make sure if African American men were allowed to vote, of course, that would usher into other rights for this particular group of people. This is the period, again, that's known as Reconstruction, because what's going to happen is with more black men being allowed the right to vote, of course, naturally they're going to do so, and you're going to have this huge influx of African American leaders that are going to be elected to the United States Congress, the Senate, all across the states. They're going to be elected to office. But unfortunately, it doesn't last long during the period of Reconstruction. It's going to end. Again, you'll get into that later with American history. But just understand that Jim Crow laws and a lot of segregation and still racial discrimination is going to exist, unfortunately, after the end of Reconstruction. And things are going to get worse. So another movement takes place, and this movement is known as the women's suffrage movement. And so this movement is led by the likes of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And this group of women, their whole goal is to make sure that women are allowed the right to vote. Now, for their particular movement, it meant so much more other than just being allowed to vote. To them, it meant like the ideal of feminism, in that eventually things would get even better and progress past the point of just being allowed to vote. And so, of course, they advocate and they march all the way to Washington. They march in front of the White House, and they're ultimately going to be victorious because in 1920, the 19th Amendment is added to the U.S. Constitution, and it is going to allow women the right to vote. And so after this happens, technically, you look at the Constitution, and technically, again, which means literally in the Constitution, this means that okay, everybody can vote now, right? So it says, you give all women the right to vote no matter their race, all men the right to vote no matter their race. Now, what could be the obstacles? As we know, if you've ever watched, of course, any type of history movie, you know that the plight for African Americans is not going to get better after Reconstruction. It's only going to get worse. And so when it gets worse, the next movement that's going to happen is going to be the period known as the Civil Rights Movement. And the goal is to, of course, advance African American rights. So during this period, and again, although the Constitution technically says all people at this point are allowed to vote, the states are going to issue many different forms of discrimination to make sure that African Americans are not allowed the right to vote. So there were so many different ones, but one of the biggest ones that the federal government sought to get rid of was poll taxes. So poll taxes is basically where states charge African Americans in particular to vote. And this, of course, is super against the Constitution. You are not allowed to do this, but southern states would do this because they knew, of course, many would not be, basically couldn't afford it. You know, that's just like modern day. If somebody told you, hey, you got to pay $100 to vote. I'm not about to pay $100 to vote. You know what I mean? And so, of course, during this period, it's even more absurd. But again, it was just a tool designed to deter African Americans the right to vote. So in 1964, Congress is going to pass the 24th Amendment, which basically says that poll taxes are banned in, of course, national elections, and that everybody can be a right to vote, and you are no longer allowed to add poll taxes as a requirement before people can actually vote. And so after the 24th Amendment is passed, so this is the period of course, this is the height of the civil rights movement, which is what that video you just watched. And so in 1965, this is right after, of course, I'm not right after, because about 2 years later, after the assassination, unfortunately, of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson gets into office, and he is going to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As you can see here, if you look closely, you'll see a lot of prominent leaders you'll probably notice. Of course, that's the president, and right here is MLK Jr. So in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it is going to do 5 crucial things. The first thing is that it is going to ban all forms of voting discrimination. So again, there's no poll taxes. You can't have a grandfather clause, which is basically where they say if your grandfather owned land, you can vote. Again, most African Americans' grandfathers did not own land at that point due to the levels of discrimination throughout the entire country at that point. So all forms of voting discrimination was outlawed. They also are going to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. Again, technically everybody was allowed to vote with the adding of these amendments, but again, just because they're on in the federal books, that doesn't mean the states were enforcing them. But now they're going to have to due to this particular law. Also, the third part, the minority right to vote across the country. Again, most of those forms of discriminations are going to be banned. They're going to outlaw literacy tests, and they're going to outlaw state or local voting qualifications. So again, they would do so many ridiculous things to make sure African Americans couldn't vote. Another one they would do is literacy tests, and it literally would be some of the most egregious questions you could ask anyone to allow them to vote. You know, for example, if you ever watch Selma, one of the things he asks this woman that's trying to vote is name all of the county judges in the state of Alabama. Very hard. I don't even know, of course, our current answer to that particular question if it was for Florida. So all of these forms of discriminations are going to be removed. But things, of course, get better over time. By the 70s, most of the methods of discriminations are going to be removed. But another issue is going to come about, and this issue is known as the 26th Amendment with the Vietnam War. And so so right now what's happening during this period is a crazy time period during the 60s. So you have the civil rights movement going on, and also you have the war at Vietnam. It was a war that killed thousands of American soldiers, highly unpopular in the U.S. And so one of the things that a lot of people started to advocate for was, if I can be allowed the right to vote, the right to serve, I should be allowed the right to vote. So before 1971, you had to be 21 years old to vote. I know to us now that sounds ridiculous, but that's how it was. So basically, you could serve in the Vietnam War at 18, but you couldn't vote at 18. So you had, of course, students all across the country that are going to advocate for this change, and eventually it's going to happen in 1971 with the adding of the 26th Amendment, which is basically where they are going to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. Of course, which is where it stands now. So if you take anything away from this particular standard, it's very important to know that the amendments are extremely hard to pass. That's one thing, very hard to pass. But also, the amendments are just an extra form of protections for groups who may not always be protected, like African Americans and other minority groups. So we got into this particular standard because, again, these are going to be super important when we get into these big cases, what we call them landmark Supreme Court cases, that is ultimately going to shape the the foundation of our nation's history, in particular as it relates to rights for everyday people. They have rights related all the way from gun rights to, of course, your basic civil liberties. All right, thank you guys. Have a good day.